In our county, Medina, there are over 150,000 people today that call it home. But just 200 years ago, around 1800, there wasn't even a permanent settlement anywhere close by. How did we go from such a sprawling wilderness to what we have in Medina today? Who built all of these beautiful homes, big buildings, winding roads, and fast highways? Where did all these people we call our neighbors and friends come from? We in Medina have a wonderful quality of life. We have a safe and prosperous county full of communities in which we can live and comfortably grow in. Did you ever ask yourself who started all this? Or who made the sacrifices to get it all going? What price did our forefathers pay to give us the life we enjoy today? It sure wasn't easy. The history of Medina County parallels the history of our nation and goes back to a time long, long ago. Christopher Columbus traveled from Spain in Europe to the southern shores of North America in 1492. For over 100 years after that, the early explorers joined the Native Americans as the only people here. It wasn't until 1620 that the Pilgrims arrived from England to settle at Plymouth Rock and set up the first permanent English-speaking colony. They came in search of freedom. They traveled all the way across the vast Atlantic Ocean with the hope that they could start a new nation where they could live and worship the way they believed was right. Since the days of the Pilgrims, millions of people from all over the world have come to America in search of their dreams. Our nation believes in freedom like no other nation on earth. We have the freedom to live a life that we believe in, to worship how we want, and the ability to create wealth in many ways. Sometimes it's easy to take all of our freedom for granted. Most of us don't even know what it's like not to be free. Our forefathers weren't that lucky. They had to work and fight to create the freedom we have today. It sure wasn't easy. Many of them paid for it with tremendous sacrifice, hard work, and even with their lives. Many of our ancestors fought and died during the wars for independence right here on our own soil. They later fought each other during the Great Civil War to end slavery. Many traveled to Europe and Asia to keep America free and fought and died on the battlefields of World War I, World War II, the conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and the war in the Persian Gulf, and in Afghanistan. Men and women from our county, Medina County, fought these wars so that we could enjoy the freedom that we have today. You, the generation of today, have a responsibility to these people. You will be handed the job and the honor of preserving everything that these valiant and brave Americans achieved. Very soon, you will be Medina's entrepreneurs, doctors, engineers, lawyers, inventors, government leaders, and civil servants. Our county will look to you and your efforts to help make it grow. You will make it prosper. You will be asked to make it safe and to protect its freedom in the future. Your education, your values, and your character will shape the Medina of tomorrow. Keep that in mind as we look at Medina County's past. Thousands and thousands of years ago, the last ice age shaped the land on which we live. The hills and valleys, rivers, lakes and streams were carved up and created by huge flows of moving ice. About 25,000 years ago, the ice here was over 1 mile thick. There was so much ice that it lowered the oceans over 350 feet. Imagine standing on ice a whole mile thick, right where you are right now. There was nothing around for thousands of miles but huge packs of solid ice. Slowly, very slowly, over a period of almost 6,000 years, the ice melted. It moved massive hills, carved out rivers, and created lakes. When it was all over, it had pushed rich and fertile soil into our area, perfect for growing trees and crops. Archaeologists believe that the last ice age allowed humans from Asia to migrate to North America. The ice built a bridge for them so that they could travel across the Bering Strait into the place we now call Alaska. They traveled down the Rocky Mountains, across the hills and plains, and even into South America. These nomads were the early ancestors of the Native Americans. They followed the migrating animals of the time and hunted them for their survival. When the animals moved, so did the people. It took these early people thousands of years to learn how to grow crops and raise livestock for food. The ancestors of these natives were named Indians by Columbus and his men because they thought they had landed in India. The name stuck, and we still call Native Americans Indians today. No great tribes of Indians lived in our area. Many passed through hunting the abundant wildlife and left remains for us to study. But Medina wasn't an early residence anyone called home. That wouldn't change for quite some time. Way back in 1662, the King of England gave to the good people of Connecticut all of the land between the 41st and 42nd parallel, starting at the Pennsylvania border and going west. This land, known as the Western Reserve, was a huge parcel of over 3 million acres.
Connecticut had suffered greatly in the Revolutionary War with the burning of villages along the coastline, and they decided that they wanted to reserve area in the west, hence the name Western Reserve, and the area became known officially as the Connecticut's Western Reserve, and that was the beginning of it. And of course, they sent Moses Cleveland to the area to survey the area, and he caused the surveying of it and the settlement of Cleveland, and then they began to sell the land. The state sold it to an organization called the Connecticut Land Company, which then the shareholders would draw lots as to where their land would be.
The land here back then was almost totally full of thick, dense forest. To even live on the land, the first pioneers had to cut down hundreds of trees just to clear a spot to camp. Could you imagine cutting down all those huge trees with just an old axe, pulling out stumps with a donkey or horse, or removing all the roots with just your bare hands? That's what life was like back then. And don't forget, if you wanted to eat, you also had to find time to hunt and then cook. Unfortunately, the early settlers still had to fear the British, who were still resentful that they had lost America's war for independence. The British were finally defeated once and for all during the War of 1812. One of the most notable battles of this war took place just north of here when Commodore Perry fought the British warships during the Battle of Lake Erie. More and more people migrated to the Medina area during and after the war. In 1818, just a few years after the British had left, Medina became a county. 13 years later, in 1831, the townships were formed. Each township had a different owner back then, so sale of parcels of land came at different times. Joseph Harris bought some land and called it Harrisville Township. Justin Warner settled Liverpool in 1811. In Litchfield, old Judge Holmes, who was an original investor, arrived around 1812. Medina and Wadsworth popped up sometime around 1814. Brunswick was first settled in 1815 and Sharon in 1816. Guilford and Westfield in 1817, Montville and Chatham in 1818, and Granger in about 1820. Spencer Township came about 1823, and old Sam Hinckley made his mark in 1825. Lafayette and York followed in 1830, and Homer Township completed the county in 1831. By 1839, the boundaries of Medina County were complete, and many Pennsylvanians and Germans came to the area to seek a better place to live and raise their families.
Generally, they found they would come with a horse, possibly if they were lucky enough, a wagon, and maybe a cow or a couple of pigs, some sheep. Sheep was also big in the early days. And they would, of course, bring their guns and their plow and an axe. And that was about all they had. Very seldom in the early days where a settler arrived here did he have any hard cash with him.
As settlers came out from the east, they would have brought firearms with them. Most any settler coming out here in the early frontier era would have brought some type of firearm for protection, also for harvesting of wild game from the woods and forests around them. If you bring a herd of livestock out here, you can't live off the livestock the first year because then you have nothing left to reproduce for future years. So you would be pretty much dependent on wild meat for your first season or two. This is a type of firearm that might well have been brought out here in the late 17 or very early 1800s. It's a flintlock mechanism. In this case, it's smooth bore. If you had a chance to look down the barrel, it'd be just like looking into a pipe. The walls of the barrel are smooth. There are no riflings in this barrel that would make the bullet spin to be more accurate. So this is a smooth bore, which would allow you to shoot either a single bullet, a large round bullet, or a load of birdshot, many very small BB-like projectiles for hunting things like squirrels or ducks or geese or something. In use then, the pioneer would pour the powder down the barrel. He would place the bullet in the muzzle and seat it with his ramrod. He would place then a small amount of priming powder here in the pan. Close the frizzen or the cover to keep the priming powder in place, and then he'd be ready to fire. When you pull the trigger, there's a large V-shaped spring inside here that would drive this hammer forward. A piece of flint in the jaws of the hammer strike the hardened steel of the frizzen, creating a spark. The frizzen will flip forward, spark drops into the pan, and the powder will ignite, which would then burn through a tiny touch hole in the side of the barrel, igniting the gunpowder inside and driving the bullet forward. So here's the ignition process. So that flash of fire would burn through a little touch hole and set the firearm off.
The first improved road, which was little more than a path cut through the woods, was Old Smith Road, now Route 18. It opened up the east-west routes for travel and commerce. A few years later, the north-south Worcester Pike, which it is still called today, opened up travel to Cleveland. The trip would take you over 14 hours one way in good weather. If you had to haul a heavy load, you'd be on the road for several days. If you were a man over 21 years old and you lived in Medina more than 3 months, you were required to work at least 2 days a month building roads. All you got was a whole 50 cents for the job, but they did feed you pretty good. Everyone worked very hard back then to build homes and barns, buildings for stores, and banks and places to gather for town meetings or to worship. The first house of worship they built was a log cabin with animal hides over the windows. Several men gathered at dawn to begin construction, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the very first service was held.
The early settlers of South America came seeking gold. The early settlers of North America came seeking God. And this whole country, when the Pilgrims came, was founded on a search for religious freedom. That was one of the reasons they came, one of the primary reasons they came, so they could worship the way they wanted to worship without the government telling them, this is the church of the government, this is how you will worship. So they came seeking that kind of freedom.
Producing salt was a big business because everyone needed it to preserve meat. Take a big piece of ham, coat it with salt, and pack it in even more salt, and it would be good for the whole winter. A bushel of salt from Medina's Salt Springs went for $5. That was very expensive, but salt was a very important commodity back then. Cutting lumber was a huge business too. Lathrop Seymour and Timothy Doane built the first water-powered sawmill in Weymouth so that trees could more easily be cut into planks and beams. Even though our early settlers were pretty isolated from the bigger cities, they stayed well informed about what was going on in the county at the time. Traveling ministers, called circuit riders, would visit on a regular basis and bring news to the people each week. Going to church, no matter where it was a very big part of life back then. It was a time to socialize and catch up with what was going on. And there was a lot going on. A topic that got a lot of everyone's attention was slavery. There was talk of civil unrest because many people wanted it stopped and wished that the slaves could all be set free. Soon, people began to fear that there would be a war between the states, and the issue of slavery was on everyone's mind. Between 1830 and the Civil War, life in Medina was rather quiet. It was a farming community. That's why people came here. Medina's principal products were wheat, flour, corn, salt, maple syrup, and whiskey. Back in the early days, children went to school till they finished the 8th grade. That's right, just 8 years of study, and you were on your own. The first school in the county opened its doors in 1817 with a total of 16 scholars. Students were all called scholars in those days.
I'm proud to say we have 3 big subjects that we study at school: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Today I learned that if a bushel of oats doesn't weigh exactly 32 pounds, it's not a full bushel of oats. I had a nice chunk of cornbread and some dried pork for lunch, and an apple from the tree near the front porch. William Cogswell, Hinckley.
Teachers were very hard to find, even though the only qualifications were that you needed to know how to read and write. The pay was a whopping $1 a week. As small businesses started to pop up, a shopkeeper could expect to earn about $125 a year with a decent business. The local cobbler or shoemaker was a popular guy. When he came around, he made your shoes from the hides you gave him.
First newspaper published here in Medina County was called the Ohio Free Press and Medina County Advisor. It was established in May or June of 1832. It was a weekly journal, come out every Tuesday morning at a price of $2 per year if you paid in advance, or $2.50 if you had to wait till the end of the year. Country produce, cordwood, taken at full market price, was just as good as cold hard cash. Now, the general character of the early papers at that time was all very much the same. Of note was the prominence given to state and national news and the almost total lack of local news. You see, the people back then either knew the local news or they could get it from their neighbors, whereas the news of the outside world could only be received from their hometown paper. Also included in virtually every paper at that time was a section called the Poets' Corner. Now, this was an area that was sacredly reserved for whatever type of poetry happened to suit the tastes of the day. Now, the papers back in that time were one page, approximately 19 by 26 inches, with 5 or 6 columns of very finely printed type.
Kids in our county back then weren't kids for long. By the time they were teenagers, they already had jobs and were starting families of their own. The old Phoenix Bank played a big part in Medina's early economy. It was started by H.G. Blake, a Medina kid that had to grow up fast. His parents died in a snowstorm, leaving him to be adopted by some family friends. Those humble beginnings didn't stop him from becoming a key figure in Medina's history.
Welcome to my hometown, Medina, a friendly place to live, I might say. During my lifetime, I was involved in many different things. I owned a grocery store, I edited a newspaper, I founded the old Phoenix National Bank, and then became involved in politics. But what I am the most proud of is my personal friendship with Abraham Lincoln and helping the Underground Railroad. In 1851, I moved my family to a house at 314 East Washington. As a matter of fact, the house still stands. I chose this house because of the many features it had to enable me to take in the runaway slaves. But the most important feature was the large barn at the rear of the house and the grape arbor that ran between the barn and the house. For under complete foliage, we could move the slaves from the barn to the house and vice versa under complete coverage. Well, after a day or so, we conducted the slaves, or passengers as we called them, up the line and onward to freedom. For Canada lay but a short buggy trip and quick boat ride across Lake Erie. It was the railroad terminology that proved to be the perfect cover-up for our many activities. And I was proud to be one of their station keepers, and I was proud to play a small part in challenging the very foundation of slavery.
Life in Medina, like everywhere else in the free world, has always been about opportunity. Trouble was, you needed to be free to enjoy it. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people living in America at the time that were not free. Medina had plenty of people back then who decided that slavery should be abolished.
Debating societies, and they would get together and debate the issues of the day, be political or philosophical. And in the case of slavery, these started as early as the 1830s and 40s, okay, where people would start to form their opinions on whether it was right or not. And of course, in some cases, you had your early settlers here who were very opposed to it and became very active in the Underground Railroad system.
The abolitionist movement was in full swing, and heated debates could be found at every church or town meeting. Tension was rising all across America, and right here too, about many issues between the North and the South. Ohio, like many states up north, started to become a center of industry. With a whole lot of hard work, railroads and canals started to make their way across the North, connecting cities and towns with ports on the lakes.
The Erie Canal, okay, when it opened up, was very profitable for the Wadsworth area. It ran through the area just east of there in in Summit County, and provided the settlers there as a means of getting their goods either up to Cleveland and east from there, or down to Portsmouth and on the Ohio River and down through that area there, maybe up to Pittsburgh or down to New Orleans.
As the North was becoming more and more industrialized, the South was growing at a much slower pace. It was dependent on only one crop from which it could make money. That was cotton. Cotton back then had to be harvested by hand, and slaves were forced to live on plantations to pick it. The Underground Railroad was started to help runaway slaves as early as the 1830s. Slaves fled from southern plantations and headed north, guided by the North Star at night. They knew that once they got to a certain area, someone would help them get to Canada.
Railroad wasn't no train. Railroad was a bunch of way stations, bunch of stops. But this woman, she had a whole series of way stations and stops, and we moved north all that time, and we followed that northern stop. Folks be laughing. You singing about following the drinking gourd. Drinking gourd ain't nothing but the north stop, and we follow that star at night, and we sleeps in the deep woods during the day, and we work our way up here. We cross the Ohio River, and I get all the way up here to Medina, and some folks help me, and I meet this gentleman, Mr. Blake. Mr. Blake helped me out. Good man. I stays here in Medina ever since then.
Hiram Miller of Hinckley is credited with escorting and sheltering over 200 runaway slaves through Medina and into Oberlin. Hiram and many other Medina residents helped many people to freedom. They knew they were doing the right thing. No one deserved to be a slave. Most Northerners were ready to fight to end the use of slaves. Some were not. To make matters worse, the people of the South were complaining about paying the high taxes and tariffs on the goods they bought from Europe. Soon, Southerners were beginning to band together to try to succeed from the Union. They wanted out. They wanted to start their own union. President Abraham Lincoln just wasn't going to let that happen. At a fort owned by the federal government, the South made its first strike, Fort Sumter in South Carolina.
I think the biggest problem with the Civil War was nobody had any idea, I don't care on what level, how big this thing was going to get and what happened. What was going to happen, it was going to all be over at Bull Run, you know, real quick. We'd clean up these guys and there'd be no problem. And you hear the stories about the picnics and all being taken to Bull Run so everybody could watch. And unfortunately, the Confederates won. And suddenly people then start to realize, and I've read a lot of people who I think are pretty good thinkers, realize this war could last 2 or 3 years. They never, ever thought it would last as long as it did or cost as much as it did in human lives. They just never did.
President Lincoln went to the nation and asked for 75,000 men to join the Union Army for just 90 days, thinking that the uprising would be swiftly stopped. Each state and every county had a quota of troops to fill. Medina was no exception.
Through the 8th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, they would have been involved in almost all the eastern battles. Gettysburg, Antietam, through the 103rd Ohio, they would have been in the Knoxville battle, all Sherman's campaign to Atlanta, the Nashville battle. There was a Medina people on Sherman's march to the sea. There would certainly have been Medina people with Vicksburg. I could say that probably Medina County, if it was researched heavily, we probably could put, in all the major battles, we could put 5, 10 people at least in all the major battles of the Civil War.
Lorenzo Vanderhoff was a soldier from Homer Township in Medina County who fought in the Civil War and kept a diary for us to read. Here are some of the thoughts of a 20-year-old kid in the middle of the worst and bloodiest war our nation has ever seen.
The actions of the people of the southern portion of the Republic was of such a nature as to endanger the existence of our present form of government. A rousing Union meeting was held at the courthouse. There were hundreds of us joined to defend the Union. At every house we passed, the ladies waved their hankies and cheered. We marched 18 miles in 7 hours today. No mail from home, no mail from Nancy. We heard guns and cannons every day. Rumors flying all over, but we think we got the Rebs beat. Something must be up. There's a lot of commotion going on. Orders to clean our guns and make sure our papers are in order. If we're going to die, we all agreed it's better to die fighting than fevering.
This is where Lorenzo's diary ended. He was shot 4 times at Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. He was left for dead on the battlefield on the day over 23,000 men died. When the Union soldiers came in to retrieve bodies, Lorenzo moved his hands. He was alive and miraculously spent a year healing in the hospital. He lived until 1912. When the war was over, Medina County had lost 154 of the 1,500 men that had joined the fight. Another 151 came home wounded. The Union Army won the war, and every slave was set free. But the nation would never again be the same. The North had lost 360,000 men, and the South 258,000. Over 280,000 were left wounded from both sides. One part of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in downtown Cleveland is dedicated to some of the men from Medina who fought one of the final battles of the Civil War.
If you look on the west side of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Cleveland, with the men with the flags and the cannon, that is the 103rd at Spring Hill. And again, if you ask these men what did they do, basically they probably saved the Union a major defeat. And they would say, no, we did our duty. And that's just the way they did these things.
The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. Less than a week later, on April 15th, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. After the Civil War and Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson became president, and Medina County, like the rest of the nation, had to heal its wounds. The Industrial Revolution would help the nation rebuild and reunite again. It filtered down to just about every township and hamlet in every state. More and more people started businesses feeding off the great inventions of electricity, steel production, and power. It was a cold and breezy day in 1865 when Amos Ives Root became curious over a swarm of bees.
One of his workmen noticed how impressed he was with the bees, and he said, "What would you give me if I could bring those bees down and put them in a box?" And he thought it was not going to be possible to take those wild insects and make them go anywhere. But this man understood that if you got the queen, all the bees would follow her. So he just brought the queen down, put her in a box, and gave him the box. And he said he would give him a day's wages, which was $1 in those days. So he gave the workman that and went home and told Sue, his wife, that he'd bought these bees for $1. And she said, "A box of bugs for $1? You've got to be kidding."
I was always inventing something or other. I did magic tricks and even developed a little road show. I was courting Susan Hall, but her father didn't think much of me. He thought I was rather odd. I got into the jewelry business, and soon I was turning over between $200 and $500 per week, which was good money. And it really turned the head of Susan Hall's father, and I was again allowed to court her.
AI announced to all that he was going to go into the bee business. He could invent a hive that could shelter the bees as well as harvest the honey and wax without destroying the hive. He became instantly hooked on the study of bee culture, and it would become his whole life. Bees were important to a farmer. They pollinated crops, made honey, and the wax from hives was perfect for canning and sealing jars of fruit or vegetables. Within a few years, he had over 6,000 bee colonies, and his company was selling bee equipment all over the world.
A letter addressed to A.I. Root would actually get to him without any address because he was so well known over the country for the fact that he had been such a sort of an evangelist for beekeeping and providing pollination for crops and producing honey and sweets for the table.
The A.I. Root Company is still in business today, over 140 years old, and is still being run by the Root family. Later in his life, AI became friends with Wilbur and Orville Wright and was with them when they made their first flight at Kitty Hawk. He wrote the first published account about the flight in his magazine.
He submitted that article to the Scientific American and magazine, who he'd been writing for ever since he was a teenager, but they refused to print it because they didn't think that it actually happened, and if it did, it would never amount to anything. So the Wright brothers told him that they thought that it would probably be good if he wrote it up in his magazine, Gleanings in Bee Culture. So Gleanings in Bee Culture had the honor of the first write-up about the Wright brothers' flight.
Mr. Root died in 1923, but he left something for the kids of Medina on how to be successful in business.
Know everything there is to be known about the business you're in. Don't go into debt. Don't be afraid to try new things. And trust the Lord.
Laura Celestia Spellman was born on Main Street in Wadsworth in 1839. She met a boy in her class, fell in love, and got married in 1864. It turned out to be a beautiful wedding for the new Mrs. John D. Rockefeller, for she had married one of the richest men in America. Over in Westfield, a small group of men were organizing to help farmers protect themselves from the devastating effects of fire. Ohio Farmers Insurance first president, George Collier, started the company in an office over Ben Austin's store. It would become the giant Westfield Insurance Company, a landmark of the county today. Medina's worst disaster, the Great Fire of 1870, reduced Public Square to a pile of ashes. 45 buildings, including the original Phoenix Bank, went up in smoke. Unfortunately, all of the county's records went with it. Because of that fire, the town was rebuilt of brick and stone. H.G. Blake was mentioned many times as one of the key men that built the city back up. The first steam-powered train rolled into Medina in 1871. All the citizens showed up to marvel at its noisy arrival. The whistle was heard in York, 4 miles away. Cannons were fired, hats flew off, shawls waved through the air, and people cheered like never before. They could have lived anywhere in the world, but Seville in Medina County is the place they chose to settle. Captain Martin Van Buren Bates and Anna Swan worked for P.T. Barnum and the greatest show on earth, where they met and fell in love. They were one of Barnum's main attractions, billed as the Giants.
People ask, were they really that tall? Anna was 7'11". The captain was 7'9". You look at the statues, he's a little bit taller because we had to enlarge his boots to balance the statue. The ceilings in this room are 9.5 feet high, so that gives a pretty good dimension. People ask if they were that big. Well, a captain weighed in somewhere around 470 pounds. Anna was a little bit lighter. She was only 413 pounds.
This small jail, which is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, has an interesting story about the captain.
This jail actually housed Captain Bates one evening. Evidently, he had gotten into an argument with someone here in town, and to have a cooling off period, the captain was placed in the cell and then released the next day. The cots that they had to sleep on were pretty small and probably had a strong mattress on them. And they're, like the bars, made out of iron.
The captain and Anna married and had the largest baby ever born. The child, baby Bates, was the size of a 6-month-old at birth. By the 1890s, the people of Medina started to see lights out on the street. Telephones were coming. All kinds of electrical gadgets were being sold. Modern merchandising had begun. Stores had packaged goods that were unimaginable only a few years before.
We have an account in the Medina County Gazette in 1899 of the first automobile to circle the square. Okay, it was a group of Cleveland businessmen who were on a joyride, and they came out. the Wooster Pike from Cleveland and made the circle around the square in Medina and then went further on south. And that was the first report of an automobile in Medina.
If you wanted to go shopping in Sharon Township, how much money do you think you would have needed? Butter is 20 cents a pound, eggs are 14 cents a dozen, wool is 40 cents a pound, and mutton, 10 cents a pound. The sale of whiskey wasn't very well regulated at that time. There were a lot of saloons where people would go and overindulge and become very intoxicated. Women from all over the county banded together to start the temperance movement to fight the growing problem.
Gather round, everyone. I am a member of the Women's Temperance League, and I am here to tell you about the wonderful work our ladies have done here in Medina to pass our own ordinance against the evils of drinking. This movement has been growing throughout the state since its first outbreak in Washington Court, Ohio. It has become known as the Women's Crusade. It is a movement not to change or strengthen the laws, but to appeal directly to the tavern owners to get them to stop selling liquor and the drinkers to stop drinking. It was a surprise visit on a moonlit Monday night to the saloons that began the fall of the liquor traffic. 92 women were involved in this crusade that saw Palmer's Drugstore signing the petition. Then Mrs. Letterly sent her stock back to the wholesalers. That left Mr. Brenner. Twice a day, the women went to his business and knelt and prayed and sang Almost Persuaded. It took 1 week, but Mr. Brenner finally signed the petition. So on May 1st, 1874, the Gazette announced that for the first time in Medina's history, it did not have a saloon.
As the 19th century ended, Medina County was prospering. The Wadsworth Salt Company was now employing over 125 people. The railroads were making businesses and farms boom. Scott Bennett and T.G. Andrews Lumber Company was growing steadily, and the Ohio Match Company, founded by E.J. Young in Wadsworth, was becoming a worldwide producer of matches. Medina was on its way to a prosperous and exciting future. By the start of the 20th century, America's economy was in full swing. Our country was just over 100 years old, and already it was leading the world in opportunities for freedom and wealth. Don't think the rest of the world didn't take notice. Between 1900 and 1913, over 13 million people from impoverished countries in Europe and elsewhere came to our shores looking to start a new and better life. The immigrants didn't find streets paved with gold or any easy answers. Everyone here wasn't rich, but here in this country, everyone had a chance if they were willing to learn and work hard. This huge influx of people didn't directly affect Medina County. Most settled in the bigger industrial cities looking for factory jobs. Nearby Cleveland was one place that had plenty of them. That made Medina County's farms start to boom because all of those new people had to eat.
You had a period of time from 1900 to 1930, the city of Cleveland grew from about 350,000 people to 900,000 people. And in that time span, those people are in there, they're working, they're employed, and they're hungry. We don't have a large amount of refrigeration out there. Fresh food is a very precious commodity. It's very much in demand. You have, of course, the development of the West Side markets and Central Market, East Side Market, but somebody has to supply that. Medina County was one of those counties that supplied the produce, supplied the eggs, the milk.
Medina farms were producing food and dairy products at record rates, and that kept the county moving.
And most of the farmers made 100% of their income from the farm. They were self-sustaining. They raised their own hogs, their chickens, their eggs. They had the wheat for the flour. They butchered a beef a year, and of course the milk. And the only thing usually they had to buy was the salt and pepper and different condiments.
Electricity came to the northeastern part of the county in the early 1900s, but it wasn't until the 1940s that the Rural Electric Cooperative hooked up the southwestern part of the county. Once power was brought to rural America and the farmer, America and Medina County began feeding the world. Can we imagine what life would be like today without electricity? Meeting a need for better transportation, the Cleveland and Southwestern Railway ran its tracks from southern Medina County to Cleveland and over to Akron. The electric-powered interurban was born.
If you were a farmer, it gave you greater access. You asked for a milk stop, and you would see that there would be a siding where the car would come up, pick up the milk in the morning, the cans, and then at night bring back the empties. So for many of the farmers, the dairy farmers particularly, they saw a real advantage to getting the fresh milk up there if they had eggs and other produce. On the way back, the train would be able to bring fresh bread, not only to the farmer, who maybe the wife didn't want to bake as much, but also the newspaper, also anything from stores up in the Cleveland area. So in the rural areas, they loved it.
Soon, the wealth of the Industrial Revolution filtered down to the county, and master craftsmen built many beautiful and luxurious homes. Henry Ford was making personal transportation affordable, too. His Model Ts, which came in any color you wanted as long as it was black, could be seen on every city street and also chasing horses off of every trail. That didn't bother the wolves and bears that called River Styx Bottoms and Windfall their home. It would still take a while for civilization to reach there. But the peaceful life here wasn't to go untouched for long. The First World War had begun. The United States reached out and helped its friends, the people of Europe, fight Germany's attempts to conquer them. World War I started in 1916, and the United States was involved in the devastation for only a year and a half. Young men from every city and township in Medina County fought in the battles and in the trenches, and some made the ultimate sacrifice for freedom. 160,000 U.S. soldiers died on the battlefields of France as the Allies defeated the German army. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the last time Americans would die on foreign soil. By now, schools were popping up all over the county, and public health nurses played a big role in keeping the community well.
Oh, my. Isn't he a handsome lad? Oh, dear. These memories I have. Oh, what a lovely smile she has. No, I never had any children. But, you know, I had more children I knew what to do with after I became the first public health nurse in Medina County. Oh, my. As a little girl, I liked to take care of things, even animals. So I guess taking care of people just kind of became natural to me. I got my training when I went to the World War I. It was a big war. That's what they called it, but it was nothing big or nice about it. It was awful. I went overseas to England to take care of all of our men, and they really weren't men. They were boys. They were hurt. And it hurt me so because I couldn't save all of them. So after a while, I came back to Ohio. I came right back down here to Medina County. Can you believe that? And that's when I started my first nursing career as a public health nurse. I went to the schools and I had more children to take care of and I knew what to do with. Oh my goodness. And not only that, we brought children down from the big cities, right down here in Medina County. Brought them down to the YM, the YWCA, yeah. You know, they had never felt the green grass tickle their toes and swim in ponds. It was great. Taking care of those children was wonderful. I had a sympathetic ear for my TB patients. That's tuberculosis. We had a terrible epidemic then, and a lot of people met their maker at that time. Oh, it was so sad. I couldn't save them all again. And I also went to jail. Oh, not me. No. I went down to jail, and I took care of the people down there. They needed to be taken care of. And I also taught them how to read and write if they wanted to learn. Some of them needed to learn something a little better than learning how to pick a lock. Oh, my goodness, it was something. Well, you know, I must have been about 98 or 99, and by then, years had kind of gotten into my bones, and I thought I'd better slow down a little bit. Me? Me slow down? Well, I went down to the Veterans Hospital, because I was a veteran by then, you know. But you know, I had a hard time giving up taking care of all those people I loved. Me, Medina County, first public health nurse.
Rumor has it that the 1920s were one of the most fun decades our country has ever seen. It was called the Roaring Twenties for good reason. People everywhere had jobs and money, and life was really good. In Chatham Township, there was even an oil rush. Hundreds of investors drilled wells on almost every lot. There were 35 drilling companies sinking wells and installing tanks and pumps. The Red Cross formed its first chapter in Medina, with the Wadsworth Red Cross opening 1 month later. In Hinckley Township, an enterprising man named Del Isham started driving his big Ford touring car up to Cleveland and back. The Green Line Bus Company was great for men who needed a ride to work in the big city. In 1923, Cleveland Metropolitan Park acquired 600 acres and built a dam that created a 100-acre lake. It took more than 12 million pounds of steel and concrete to stop the river that ran through John L. Johnson's property. The Hinckley Reservation has been the county's most beautiful natural showplace ever since. Things were looking great in America until one day in 1929 when the stock market crashed, causing the greatest depression the world has ever seen. Soon, people all across the nation couldn't pay their bills, and many families lost their jobs, their savings, and their homes. Almost 1/4 of the people in the United States, 1 in every 4, a whopping 24.9%, were hopelessly unemployed. The 29,677 people living in Medina County were able to weather the Depression relatively well. People still had to eat. Agriculture saved their livelihood, and life on the farm was still just as busy and a very nice way to live.
In farming, you share problems and you share good things, and it's something that you just can't put a price tag on. It's a wonderful closeness that develops between grandfather, father, and son.
The people of Medina County were very fortunate to have agriculture as their source of income. The state of Ohio, with its huge industrial centers, had record unemployment of 37%. 869,000 other Ohioans were on the streets with no income at all. Over in Europe, things were even worse. Adolf Hitler's Germany invaded Poland, and his troops pushed quickly across the continent into France on their way to Britain. On the other side of the globe, Japan was invading China. The United States watched as the whole world seemed to be once again at war. The Lend-Lease Act was then established to help our allies in Europe with weapons, tanks, and aircraft to help them fight for their freedom. This made the United States economy begin to recover rapidly because manufacturing was reaching tremendous heights never before seen in all of our history. Soon, American soldiers and pilots were volunteering for missions to help the British defend their homeland. Germany was occupying most of Europe, with many countries unable to even put up a fight. The American people didn't want war, but it wouldn't take long for our involvement to become inevitable. On December 7, 1941, as the entire Pacific Fleet rested at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the Japanese staged a surprise attack so staggering that it shook the world.
Everybody was pretty much in a state of shock as we went off to high school on Monday morning following Pearl Harbor, realizing that our country had had its Navy blown out of the waters, and that we were now going to be more directly involved than just being part of the Allied force to assist England.
Now the United States had to fight a war on two fronts. The first strike was on February 2nd, 1942, in the Pacific, as Navy and Marine planes pounded Japanese emplacements on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. Soon after, General Doolittle launched a daring attack on the Japanese mainland. On April 18, 1942, his men flew 16 large planes off the aircraft carrier the USS Hornet. All of the planes attacked Tokyo, but many didn't survive the fight. On June 6, 1944, U.S. forces landed on Omaha Beach in Normandy, France, to begin the bloodiest battles of the war. Many never even made it to the sand, but the troops persisted, and eventually the battle was won.
And our generation, like I say, I think that we gave because we felt that this is a debt that we owe our country. And you can't just fully expect that people that haven't been through it, a similar situation, can appreciate it fully like we can.
Back home in Medina County, several small companies were helping with the war effort. All across America, people were working around the clock to give our fighting men and women all the support they needed. People in Medina County, like everywhere else, were making sacrifices every day.
Let's not forget that on the home front, rationing is happening, and they're doing without food, they're doing without gasoline, they're doing without all of the commodities of civilian life. And and over there, of course, in France, those people didn't have half of what we had even back here.
Patriotism was at an all-time high. Stunning symbols of this were the victory ships. These vessels were designed to supply the war effort, and most were named for cities and towns. In 1943, Medina County's Frank Judkins circulated a petition to have one name the SS Medina. The following year, Mrs. A.B. Chaffee christened the 10,800-ton SS Medina Victory and made the people of the county proud. For a few short hours on weekends, people could forget the war and have some fun at dance halls all over the county. Some of your grandparents can remember these shows, and they danced just like this. The war raged on in Europe until every one of Hitler's troops was defeated. Soon after, Ohio Colonel Paul Tibbets dropped the first atomic bomb on Japan. The devastation was finally over. To say that people in the United States were happy would have been an understatement. There were parades and celebrations like none ever before seen. America and Medina County were on their way to peaceful and prosperous times once again. The last half-century has been a pretty good time for the U.S. and for our Medina County. With 2 world wars and the Great Depression behind them, people everywhere across America embraced the 1950s with new hope and renewed patriotism. The conflict in Korea kept our military busy, but for the most part, everyone was ready to put the thought of war behind them. The fabulous 50s saw Americans fall in love with the automobile, new appliances, and a music called rock and roll. 1 in every 7 jobs in the country were related to the automotive industry. People just loved their cars, and when they weren't busy driving them, they watched TV. It's hard to believe that television has only been around such a short time, but it really was pioneered in the 50s. The tube gave people a picture of prosperity they could focus on and really see. New cars, new washers and dryers, refrigerators, stoves, and many new products were introduced to viewers for the first time on TV. Soon, television was bringing images from all over the world into every home in Medina County. The only thing coming into the county faster than TVs were the homes popping up all over to put them in.
People coming back from the wars, the Korean War, the World War II had the GI Bill. It was something like $1,000 down. I moved to Brunswick in 1958, and our mortgage was 4.3% with $1,000 down. A very nice house for the time, 3 bedrooms, you know, a bathroom. I didn't think about 2 bathrooms at those times.
More people and more homes meant the county needed a lot more phones. Technology wasn't really up to the challenge, so everyone had party lines that were anything but a party.
The majority of people had 8 party lines, which means you shared your phone with 8 other families. And so when you picked up the phone, the likelihood of there being somebody else on the phone was pretty high. There was an etiquette that went along with it. You picked up the phone, and if someone was talking, you hung up. But of course, they heard you pick up and hang up. If you were the person talking, it was your obligation then to say, well, I've got to cut this short, somebody else needs the line. So if you were lucky, if you lived near the phone company, within about a mile of the phone company, you got a 4-party line. Oh, that was like heaven. You know, you had a 4-party line. To get a 4-party line, you had to wait like 7 years if you lived outside of the area.
The 1950s saw Medina County grow by an unbelievable 62% in just 10 short years. People were moving in at record rates, and new businesses started by ordinary people began to boom too. It was a mini-industrial revolution that Amos Mears had a large part in starting.
In 1956, a man named Amos Mears retired from his business in Cleveland, which was the Cleveland Lathe, sold his business, moved to Medina, and got interested in our town. And in 1957, he built the Medical Arts Building out across from the cemetery. In 1958, he bought the old Wallace Implement Building down in Medina and changed it into a professional building. And in 1959, he bought about 57 acres out here on the edge of town and opened up an industrial park.
Far away in another part of the country, a young woman was unknowingly starting a powerful movement by simply not giving up her seat on a bus. Rosa Parks refused to get up and give the place she was sitting to a white man, something she could be and was arrested for. Segregation wasn't a part of our past in Medina County, but it was a big problem in the southern states. African Americans were treated much differently. Some didn't even have the right to vote, even though it had been almost 100 years since the end of the Civil War. The Rosa Parks incident was one of many that ignited the flame of the civil rights movement and made men like Martin Luther King and President John F. Kennedy move to change the country so that freedom could be for all, regardless of color. As the 60s came to our county, change was ever present. Science and technology were bringing new challenges almost every day. In a monumental move, Russia put the first satellite into space, and the world had its first man-made object circling high above it in outer space. Soon after, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to orbit the Earth and the space race was on to see who could be the first to get to the moon. The United States and Russia worked feverishly to see who could meet the challenge the quickest. Once allies, they were rapidly becoming enemies in a new Cold War of democracy against communism. Our country suffered a great setback that some people say changed the world forever. On November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was traveling through Dallas, Texas, when he became the victim of an assassin's bullets. Lee Harvey Oswald was accused of the crime, but he died at the hands of a man named Jack Ruby before he could be tried. We beat the Russians to the moon, as President Kennedy had promised in July of 1969, when 2 American astronauts landed their craft named the Eagle in the Sea of Tranquility. One of them was Ohioan Neil Armstrong, the very first man to set foot on the surface of the moon. The other was Buzz Aldrin. A third astronaut named Michael Collins circled high above the surface in a recovery craft, watching and waiting to take them all back home. Home was becoming a very different place at that time in America. We were involved in a conflict that many people didn't understand. The Civil War between North and South Vietnam was becoming a struggle between democracy and the totalitarian government of communism.
The people of Vietnam at that time had been at war with somebody for the better part of 800, 900 years. I learned a little Vietnamese. I got to know some Vietnamese, and the one thing that always stuck with me was a saying they had, that war's like rain. Sometimes it rains and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you got war and sometimes you don't.
Many people were very opposed to the war and believed we had no business being involved in the affairs of such a far-off and foreign country. But many American soldiers died there defending our freedom.
I think it's obvious when your country is attacked that that is a threat to your freedom and your country's freedom. Vietnam, no Vietnamese attacked us, other than the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and that was really minor. But I think what some people fail to realize is that if you don't fight for other countries' freedoms, it will come back to haunt you. I think that's evident throughout the world. There's a totalitarian government out there. Once they've got their own people under their thumb, they will look outside their borders and it will spread. And that doesn't matter to me whether it's a communist totalitarianism regime or Nazis or religious fanatics or what. If that is allowed to exist and people are placed in that position where they have no freedom, it's going to spread like a virus. There is no room in this very, very small and ever smaller world for totalitarianism and freedom to coexist. One will spread and the other won't, and that's the way it's going to be.
Back at home in Medina County, the development of a national highway system that included Interstate 71 was putting us on the map.
The interstates were built in the 60s, 50s and 60s, so when I-71 was put in place, when it was constructed, I think that really set the stage for what we're seeing today, just in terms of growth, just in terms of residential growth alone. Certainly, communities that are near interstates have a real economic development edge over communities that aren't as well. And that edge is going to continue through the coming decades. There's no question in my mind, because just like people want to be able to move about freely and easily, so do companies.
By the 1970s, the interstate was bringing almost more new businesses and more new residents in our county than ever before. It was a period of 37% growth, the second largest to the decade of the 50s. More homes and buildings were built to house the new families and new ventures.
But many of these were small industries where entrepreneurs got their first opportunity to have their own building. Many of them moved out of a two-car garage and had their first building here.
Soon, our county was building more and better schools to educate and train students for great jobs and wonderful careers right here in our own hometown. The cities and townships of Medina have always had a unique culture that allowed the biggest business and the smallest enterprise to coexist in a relaxed harmony.
It has always been a community of small towns and villages and crossroads and tightly knit people who attempted to help each other as overcome difficulty, and we still try to do that today.
Taking care of people has always been at the forefront of our county's history. There is no better evidence to this than the way Medina General Hospital has grown over the years. Starting as little more than a clinic with 35 beds, today it employs almost 1,000 people, nurses and doctors, who provide the best possible care. But at the heart of it all, what still makes our county a thriving community?
Agriculture is still the single largest industrial component of the county. And you might not think of agriculture as industry, but it certainly is, because industry is there to produce a good, and that's what the farmers do. Farming is still very big in the county. There'll be parts of this county that I think that will still be farming 50 years from now, and I hope that that's the case.
As you can see, the past residents of Medina County worked very hard to make our community the place it is today. Think about how living here affects you. You are here because people just like you grew up and did their best to make your hometown a better place. You are here because countless people strive to preserve the gift of freedom. Now the gift is yours, and you have been entrusted to preserve it and pass it on so that future generations can enjoy the quality of life we have today. Mr. Blake's Old Phoenix Bank helped people invest millions and millions of dollars in our community for you. Companies like Westfield Insurance, RPM, MTD, and a myriad of hundreds of smaller enterprises provided the jobs that drive our local economy and pay for your community's resources and schools. These kinds of institutions are what made America great. They seized the opportunity that freedom makes possible and made the United States the great country it is today. Much of our world is impoverished and oppressed. Billions of people will never have the opportunities that we have. What should you learn from this?
Be happy. Enjoy what you've got. And always be aware that what we've got is a great deal compared to most of the world. The small things that you don't even think about, like turning water tap on and getting water, hot water, a roof over your head, air conditioning. These things are precious. Enjoy every minute of them, because you may have to suffer without them one of these days.
Now it's your turn. It's up to you to take your life, your freedom, and use your talents and skills to make your future everything it can be. It's your job and your duty to make your own future. And Medina County is still the best place for you to make it all happen. On the outskirts of our county, there's a very special place that you should visit. It's a place where you can go and pay your own special tribute to some of the people who sacrificed to give you the opportunity you have today.
The veterans here are from all wars, dating back prior to the First World War and the Spanish-American War, and it goes up through Desert Storm, Korea, and Vietnam. Many of these veterans are from our area, and some are from all over the country, but this is just a very hallowed ground for a very beautiful national cemetery.
Our world will always be a place where good struggles against evil. Freedom and the American way of life will always be challenged, even on our own shores. We must all never take what we have for granted. We must all live to preserve the rights that our forefathers worked so hard to create. Practice your freedoms. Get to know your neighbors. Volunteer in your community and develop your own little niche in this great society you've been given. Trust yourself. Trust your judgment and your upbringing. Be proud of the character you've developed living here in Medina County. Just like all of the people that came here to the Western Reserve to make life better, you too can make a difference. Have a great life here in Medina County, and never forget where you came from.
America for Me by Henry Van Dyke. 'Tis fine to see the old world and travel up and down among the famous palaces and cities of renown, to admire the crumbly castles and the statues of the kings, but now I think I've had enough of antiquated things. So it's home again, America for me. My heart is turning home again, and there I long to be, in the land of youth and freedom beyond the ocean bars, where the air is full of sunlight and the flag is full of stars. Oh, it's home again, America for me. I want a ship that's westward bound to plow the rolling sea, to the blessed land of room enough beyond the ocean bars, where the air is full of sunlight and the flag is full of stars.